Hi, and welcome to another podcast from Ian Wallace, the Master Counsellor. Today, I'm looking at something that therapists nowadays are getting more involved with, which has changed because of computers and Zoom, Teams, and Google Meets, all these kind of interactive processes that we do a lot of our work with, which prior to COVID probably wasn't a bigger majority of our work as it was during COVID, where all counsellors had to, near enough, find these new ways of working and get connected to technology and all these kind of wonderful things that we can do with it nowadays. So it's becoming more of a feature, and certainly when you're working with agencies, of which there's 3 or 4 nowadays, that do tend to work in different countries. And so your clients may not be English, Great Britain, based in this country. They could be based in any country in the world. And that sometimes raises difficulties in all sorts of things. But if we're working for agencies, and they do that in other countries, and get people from all over the world contacting them and working with them, then there's 3 or 4 different things that might be issues that you might need to think about before you take them on as a client. First of all, if they're in another country, there might be another time zone, and so you might be working during the day in the UK, and that might be their night time, and so you would need to work not the normal hours you work, which can be 12 hours different in that process. So it's not easy when you don't have that information. So when we do assessments face to face in the UK, we probably won't ask those kind of questions about nationality or what kind of area of the world they're gonna be connecting from. So we might get an address details, email address, contact details, but it won't be such a big thing within the work. If we're working with somebody from a different country, then first of all, are we able to work with that person? Which might sound a really ridiculous thing to say, but in some countries, no, you can't. In some countries, you are not allowed unless you live and are within that country or even within that state in America. So when you're working with people from abroad, from different countries, first thing to do is find out which country, obviously, before you say yes to the work, and then check with your insurance company as to whether or not they will cover you if there is any issues with that piece of work, because the insurance company do have a view on those kind of things, where they will represent you, where they won't. So the legal side of it is an interesting one, and data and protection information, ICO registration. So those kind of things are UK based, but again, it might be different in a different country. So knowing where your client's based, where they are. Like when I first started, there wasn't much of this, to be fair, because we're going back 30 years. The internet really wasn't here in a lot of ways. And we used to say, well, okay, they had to be resident of the UK, and they had to have a UK bank account. And that was the way we got around it. And if they had those 2 things, then pretty much we could say they were based in Britain. They might be working in another country. They might connect with us through the telephone, those kind of things. But they would have a UK address or a UK base. So that made it easier for us. Whereas nowadays, as I've said, people can come from anywhere in the world. So you need to do that, check out where, and check out whether an insurance company will cover you for the work that you're doing, or if there's some legal processes that mean you can't. Over and above that, if you do start the work with that person or persons, then you also have to think about what is their connections in that country. What support do they have? Where is that support? What would happen if, you know, somebody said they felt like committing suicide? Who would you put them in touch with? What referral information would you give? So you do need to be more mindful of those referral routes and the kind of the way that country or that state deals with those kind of situation scenarios. Because again, you might be working the way you would normally work, and you might then be putting that client at risk. And there may be legal laws that say these things are against their laws or cultural laws. So we need to be mindful when we're working with people from another country, a lot more than we do with people from the UK. Yes, there will be some cultural differences in the UK, but they usually have to abide by UK laws. So from that point of view, we can get an idea, and we would know the national organisations such as Samaritans and Mind and these kind of places where people could contact, no matter where they are in the UK. So from that point of view, we need to have that referral understanding. So there's a need to do some checking, there's a need to do some fact finding, there's a need to do some work on that. Now over and above that, if that wasn't enough, then we've got the cultural aspects of that person in that world. You know, what is the cultural norms? What is the cultural messages? How does that work within family systems? Do they have particular ways of looking at the world or work in the world that we are not aware of? So there's going to be a lot of asking questions and ascertaining information about the clients or clients and their processes. And you might need to major more on their mental health or physical health or their past connection to therapy, and what that looked like. Who was it with? How did it go? When was it? So you might need to do a lot more information gathering around that process, just to make sure that your client, at the end of the day, is able to be safe and secure. I'm a great believer in doing worst case scenario. What is the worst thing that could happen? And if I cover myself for the worst thing that could happen, then pretty much I'm going to be okay. I've put my head there, I've given myself some details, some facts, some understanding. I think that's a very helpful way to look at it. What happens if? Because those kind of things can happen. People can, unfortunately, take their own lives. They can be in abusive relationships without any hope of getting out. They can be in death and dying aspects of the world. There's a lot of unrest in the world. So all those things might be something that you need to manage, need to become aware of. And you need to have your own boundaries on that, because there may be things that the clients would like to work with that you wouldn't feel comfortable or you weren't competent enough to work with. So there's a lot of things to think about before we accept clients from a different country. As I've said, nowadays though, that is becoming more the norm. Not just a different area of the UK, different country of the world. Because we can do this now, we can share information anywhere with a Wi-Fi signal, basically. And so we need to be more mindful, more able to process those worries, concerns, fears, ways of working. And also for yourself as a therapist. It might seem exciting to work with somebody from another part of the world. And that's good, nothing wrong in that. Obviously, we extend our awareness, our understanding by doing new work. But if you're in an organisation and you're working through an organisation such as an EAP or one of these registration directories, then they have their own processes and policies that you probably would have to adhere to. So again, it's a good idea to find out what they are before you get into a situation where you're starting to work with somebody outside of the UK, because then you'll know before anything may or may not occur, you'll know what your limitations are and what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. Because their rules, in a sense, when you're working as a counsellor through any agency or EAP, the client is the client of that agency or EAP. It's not wholly your client, because they will have some rules, some processes that you have to adhere to, because they're giving you their client to work with. And so there's a lot more, as I've said, a lot more information, a lot more need to understand what's happening, what's going on. Language might be a difficult process, because even if somebody speaks English in another part of the world, then the language may not be the same, or the understanding of that word might not be the same, because it can be vastly different. So you need to be mindful of having a more of a feedback of what you're saying or what they're saying, to make sure we're actually meaning the same thing, because it can get lost in some aspects. And we all have those kind of comedic aspects of the words in Australia and the words in the UK, or the words in America and the words in the UK are different, even though they're the same word. So we do need to be mindful that there's more feedback, more communication, more understanding. And so it might be a bit more stuttered, the work, by stopping and saying, I'm sorry, what did you mean by that? Not with every word, obviously, but there might be some that trip you up. And as you're working with that person and you're building that therapeutic alliance, that trust with that person, then, as most clients do, to be fair, what they walk in the door with as their first process of, this is what I'm working on, this is what I want to do. With most clients, we start in one place, but we don't finish in that place. We move into more trust, more connection, more therapeutic bond, and the clients kind of disclose more. So it isn't just an assessment on day one. It's probably going to be a continuous assessment, which most clients, obviously, without working with clients from the UK, we would do a continuous assessment. But it's be more mindful of it, more mindful of where they're at. Because if they're working online, as I'm working with you now, then that process of safety and security is a lot more worrying, because you can't just contact them. You can't find somebody and say, can you send an ambulance to? Can you send the police to? This is the person. Because obviously the UK won't work with the person outside the UK, quite naturally. So there is more risk within that world and that work, which you do need to be ready for. Now, hopefully, you will never need it. Hopefully, everything will be fine and it'll just go according to plan. But in my worst case scenario world, sometimes there's scenarios which need to be thought about prior to anybody getting involved in it or starting to work with it. Because that aspect of the work can be risky for both the counsellor, therapist, and the client, because we can find ourselves in places which really we don't feel comfortable quite easily sometimes. So having all those thoughts, ideas, check it out with your supervisor, check it out with your insurance company, all those things already in place is really, really helpful to get. Now, obviously, language being not the same in every country, as we've said, then again, the aspect of communication might be an issue, might be something that you really have to be out there with because of the dialect, because of the kind of the way that the communication's given. It might not be as clear, might not be as easy to understand. You're working through a third party with this laptop, camera, telephone, whatever you're contacting through. So those kind of things might be harder to work with when you're working in different countries. Because you might know that in the UK, yeah, the Wi-Fi signal's pretty good. Most places, okay. Then there's something like 15% of the country where it isn't. But within another country, then the Wi-Fi can just go off and just turn it off depending on where they're working, where they're living. So you do need to be mindful of, giving some feedback to the client about what happens if your Wi-Fi goes off. How do I connect back with you? Because you could then try to connect through a telephone, for example, but then the telephone is not with that person. The telephone might be just in a room on its own. It might be a family telephone, and somebody else could pick it up. So you do need to be mindful of confidentiality more, and data and confidentiality and data connections, or data. Oh, words gone out of my head now. Dyslexia rules. Data. I want to say containment, but it's not true. They'll be all shouting at me now. Oh, is this word here? And unfortunately, I can't hear you. But that's okay. So yes, having that process of data and confidentiality and getting that information and what you do with the information and what information you need to do might be different. It might be the same, but it might be different. But at least you have to ask the question. You have to elicit an answer. And this aspect of working with people from different countries, as I say, is becoming more the norm. And I think the insurance companies are starting to catch up with it to a certain degree. So your insurance company might not necessarily have all the answers there and then. They may need to go away and think about it and come back to you. But at least they'll know what you're doing. All that needs to be done before you start the work with the client. Because if you can get it all done before that and get yourself sorted and know where you are and know what's happening, then you won't get those hiccups further down the line because you'll have some kind of response. Because, if you're in with a client and you're doing the work and all of a sudden the client says something like, well, my husband hit me, and they're in an Asian community, living over there somewhere in Asia, then what would you do? How would you manage that? And those kind of things are not easy to do in the moment. You can't just say, hold on a second, I'll just pick up the phone and speak to my supervisor. That usually is not available, or not within that minute, certainly. So having that preemptive process, that tools in your toolbox, what happens if, is really important. Because as I said, that's probably going to be more appropriate, more the norm as we go through the next 5-10 years. And if you haven't got those kind of ideas, those structures in place for yourself, then it's not going to be easy to cope with these situations and scenarios as they arise. Hopefully I've given you food for thought, but it is going to be more of our work in the future. So you do need to get your head around it if you have clients outside of the UK, obviously. And for your colleagues, the people that you work with, people that you connect to. If you want to like and share this and subscribe to it, please do so, because they may find that they get themselves in situations where it's not easy to get a safe, secure therapeutic process with the client and yourselves. Hopefully that's made sense. Hopefully I've at least aired something that you can question around and kind of have conversations about. And hopefully that will be helpful for the future. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care.